I think I should start by introducing myself. My name is Grazia, and at the age of 28, I've already experienced enough family drama to last a lifetime. My early childhood memories are quite vague, but I remember excerpts from the time when my father was still alive. I was only 5 years old when he died, and to be honest, his face in my memories is getting more blurred every year. Mom didn't waste any time moving on. A year later, she remarried, and a year later, my half-sister, Zeta, was born. Don't get me wrong. My stepfather was actually a decent guy. He treated me well enough for the 10 years he was around. But when I was 15, he and my mom broke up. That's when things really started to change. Mom didn't have to work because the alimony was good, but she developed this disgusting habit of constantly reminding me that my own father left us nothing, while my stepfather's money fed and clothed me. Mom didn't know that I knew the truth about our house. It belonged to my father's parents, and when I turned 18, my grandfather, rest his soul, transferred ownership to my name. I'll never forget the night my mom cornered me about it. "Gracia, what are you going to do with the house?" "Stop it," she demanded, her eyes fixed on me like a hawk's. I remember being genuinely confused. "Nothing. You and Zeta can continue to live here as always." How her face instantly softened, and how quickly she hugged me. I should have realized it was manipulation, but I was young and still desperately needed her approval. I worked my ass off in school, got a full college scholarship, and completed my internship through sheer determination, unlike my sister Zeta, who is now 21 and treats college as an inconvenience. I understood the value of education, maybe because I had to earn everything by myself, while I ended up paying for her tuition when she turned 18. Yes, you heard right. I'm paying for my sister's college tuition. Mom somehow convinced me that it was my duty. When Zeta graduated from high school, her mother said, "Now you can afford it," pretending that I owe them something. I agreed to pay for a public college, even though Zeta wanted some fancy private school. Looking back, I should have realized this as the first red flag of many to come. It was just another Tuesday when everything started to fall apart. I went to my mom. Technically, it was my house, but I never brought it up at our usual family dinner. I had barely crossed the threshold when Zeta burst in after me, practically bouncing off the walls in her excitement. "Oh my God, my God, my God." She jumped like a child on Christmas morning. "Zeta, what the hell?" I tried to get her attention, but she just kept screeching and dancing around the living room. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she calmed down enough to blurt out, "Felice proposed. I'm getting married." Felice was our neighbor, a decent guy. I had known him for many years. My heart took this weird little turn. I recently caught my boyfriend cheating and had to end everything, so the wedding news wasn't exactly what I wanted to hear. But I put on the smile of my best older sister. Wow, Zeta. Congratulations. But aren't you still in the middle of college?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Who cares about college? This is much more important." "Zeta, education," I started, but my mother cut me off. "Oh, dear, this is wonderful news." Mom intervened, completely ignoring my concerns. "We need to start planning immediately. Should we book a restaurant, or maybe that new place in the city center?" I sat at the table and watched them exchange ideas, which were becoming more complex and expensive by the minute. The familiar feeling of being the only adult in the room began to creep up on me. "We will invite at least 200 guests," Zeta exclaimed, flushed with excitement. "And white pigeons, lots of white pigeons. Don't forget about the ice sculpture, dear," Mom added, as if that was as important as having a priest at the ceremony. I couldn't take it anymore. "I have to go home," I said, getting up from the table. "I have to go to work tomorrow." None of them noticed me leaving. They were too busy making their grand plans, discussing the wedding of the century. As I drove back to my apartment, an uneasy feeling grew inside me. Something told me that this was just the beginning of a much bigger problem. It's been a week since Theta's big statement, and I started to think that maybe I was being too paranoid. Maybe they'll find a way to handle it on their own. But then the phone rang. It was Mom. She had that tone that parents use when they're about to ask for something important. "Gracia, dear, can you come in? We need to have a serious conversation." When I arrived, Zeta was already there. She was literally shaking with excitement, and there was a huge folder full of magazine clippings and notes in front of her. Before I could sit down, she started her speech. "I've planned everything perfectly," she announced enthusiastically, feverishly flipping through the pages that looked like they were worth a fortune. "The place I want has this amazing garden with a fountain. They also release hundreds of white pigeons immediately after the ceremony." I tried to keep a neutral expression on my face, but my stomach was already doing somersaults. "That sounds expensive." "Well, about that." Zeta took out a piece of paper covered with numbers. "I've calculated everything." When she handed me this piece of paper, I swear my heart stopped for a second. The numbers I saw were not just high. They were crazy. The venue itself cost more than my annual rent. And there were pigeons, live music, not just any band, but, according to her, famous ice sculptures, designer dresses, an open premium bar, gourmet catering. "Are you kidding?" I asked, unable to keep the sharpness out of my voice. Zeta grabbed the paper back and ran her eyes over it, as if checking the calculations. "No, why would I joke? Everything is quite reasonable." "Is it reasonable?" I managed to say. "Zeta, that's more than some people spend on a down payment on a house." That's when the waterfall started. Her face wrinkled, her lips trembled, and she burst into tears. "You're just jealous," she blurted out. "You're just jealous that your boyfriend cheated on you, and now you're alone." "Grace." Mom's voice cut through my nerves. But she didn't reproach her. She looked at me reproachfully. "How dare you upset your sister like that?" I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Listen, I'm already helping you a lot. I'm paying for your college, your living expenses, buying you clothes." "Oh, let's go." Mom interrupted, her face flushed. "Are you going to throw it all in her face?" "That's what a family does, Grace. We help each other. You're just doing your duty as a big sister." I stood up, feeling my hands tremble. "I'm leaving. This is ridiculous." "Great." Zeta called after me as I headed for the door. "I'd rather ask Dad for money. And don't wait for an invitation to the wedding, because you're too selfish to help." I slammed the door behind me, but not before I heard my mom comforting her. "Don't worry, honey. It's always been difficult with your sister. We'll figure something out." The next 2 weeks were blissfully quiet. No calls from Mom, no messages from Zeta, no attempts to make me feel guilty or manipulated. I was finally able to focus on my work and enjoy the peace. For once, there was no drama in my life. But like all good things, it couldn't last forever. One afternoon, the phone rang. I looked at the screen and was surprised. It was my stepfather. We hadn't spoken for a long time, although after his divorce from my mother, our relationship remained pretty decent. "Gracia, do you have a minute?" He sounded tired. "Of course." "What happened?" "Your mom and Zeta came to see me," he said, and I heard him sigh heavily. "They showed me this wedding budget." I couldn't help but laugh. "Let me guess. Do they want you to pay for the extravaganza they've arranged?" Until I saw the numbers, he continued, and there was bitterness in his voice. "Gracia, what the hell are they thinking? Zeta hasn't worked a day in her life. She's still in college. Which one you're paying for, by the way. And she wants a wedding that costs more than my first house. I rolled my eyes. They tried to make me pay for it first, I confessed. When I refused, Zeta threw a tantrum and said she would ask you for money. He grinned, but it wasn't a happy grin. Well, I told them no. Zeta may be my daughter, but I'm not going to encourage that kind of behavior. It's time for her to learn the value of money. We talked a little more, sharing our frustrations about the situation. It was nice to know that I wasn't the only one who thought it was crazy. But this calmness did not last long. A week later, Mom and Zeta showed up at my house without warning. They didn't even mention their failed attempt to extort money from my stepfather. Instead, they came armed with a new budget, still ridiculous, but less astronomical than the first one. You see, Zeta said, thrusting a piece of paper into my hands. We've cut everything down. Now you can help. I looked at the numbers. They removed the pigeons in the famous band, but it still came out much more expensive than I could afford. Zeta, I still can't pay for this. You can take a loan, she shrugged, as if it was the most obvious solution in the world. I stared at her, expecting her to laugh and say she was joking. But no. My younger sister really suggested that I get into debt for her wedding. That's actually a great idea, Mom chimed in, beaming as if Zeta had just solved the problem of world hunger. The payments will be small if they are distributed over several years. That was my limit. I got to my feet, went to the front door, and opened it. Out. Both of them. Gracia, you're being so selfish. Zeta spat out, gathering her things. I hope you die alone. Mom gave me one of her trademark disappointed looks. I really thought I raised you better, Gracia. I didn't answer. I just closed the door behind them. And then she slowly sank to the floor, holding her head in her hands. Somehow, I knew this wasn't the end. With my family, it's never the end. A month has passed. I threw myself into my work, doing everything I could to forget about the wedding drama. Then came the birthday of my Aunt Sarah, my father's sister. She was one of the few connections I had left on his side of the family. I couldn't miss this event, even knowing that Mom and Zeta would be there. The party was held at Aunt Sarah's house, a cozy, warm place with family photos on the walls. I've always loved looking at them, especially the pictures with my dad. He died when I was only 5 years old, and every year his image in my memory became more and more blurred. But here, among the old yellowed photographs, I could at least try to put together more fragments of memories about him. When I arrived, the tension in the room instantly became palpable. Mom and Zeta were already there, huddled in a corner, whispering to each other and casting glances in my direction that seemed like they could cut themselves. I ignored them and went straight to Aunt Sarah. Happy birthday. I hugged her tightly, grateful for at least one normal family relationship in my life. Gracia, honey, she hugged me to her, and there was so much warmth in her voice that I wanted to cry. I've heard about everything. Are you okay? I just nodded and handed her the gift. The next hour was awkward, but bearable. I talked to my cousins, whom I hadn't seen for a long time, and carefully moved around the room, avoiding bumping into my mother and Zeta. Everyone seemed to be walking on tiptoe, clearly aware of the family drama, but desperately trying to maintain the appearance of celebration. And then it was time for toasts. My stomach clenched when my mom stood up with a glass in her hand. She had that expression on her face that always foreshadowed trouble. I'd like to say a few words, she began, and there was an artificial softness in her voice that I knew all too well. Dear Sarah, you are such a wonderful daughter-in-law. You always support your family. Unlike some people here. You understand how important it is to help your loved ones. The room became too quiet. I felt something boiling inside of me. You know, My mother continued, looking directly at me. It breaks my heart to see what some children become. You raise them, sacrifice everything for them, and they grow up to be selfish and ungrateful. That's all. I've had enough. I stood up so abruptly that the chair scraped loudly on the floor. That's enough, I said, my voice steady despite my trembling hands. Do you want to talk about ingratitude? Good. Let's talk. I took a step forward, feeling anger rising inside me like a wave. Let's talk about how you live in my house. Yes, in the house that my grandfather left me. Not for you. Let's talk about how I pay for Zeta's college, her clothes, her expenses. And all this time you've been making me feel guilty for not taking credit for her ridiculous wedding. There was a dead silence in the room. Zeta burst into tears, just as ordered. How dare you? Mom flushed with rage. I gave birth to you. I raised you. And that's how you repay me? Worthless, muttered Zeta, sobbing. Greedy? I asked, my lips curling into a smile that had no humor in it. Do you want me to be greedy? Great. I'll show you what greed is. Get out of my house. You have 2 weeks to move out. Mom turned pale. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm more than serious. In 2 weeks, if you don't move out, I'll get lawyers involved. There was a deathly silence in the room. My relatives looked at me with their mouths open. Zeta sobbed even harder, but this time I didn't care. I turned to Aunt Sarah, who looked sad but understanding. I'm sorry I ruined your birthday, I said, hugging her goodbye. I'll call you later. When I left the house, I heard my mom shouting something after me, but I didn't turn around. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely put the key in the ignition of the car. But as soon as I did, I went straight home and poured myself a very large glass of wine. The next morning, my phone was littered with messages and missed calls from my mom. I've read the first few. Gracia, please, you can't do this to us. I didn't mean what I said. Where should we go? You're being ridiculous. I blocked her number. But, of course, it wasn't the end. Over the next few days, relatives started calling. Some tried to be diplomatic. Others were openly hostile. My cousin Samuel's call was revealing. Listen, Grazia, I understand that you're upset, he said. But you can't just throw your own mother out on the street. Watch me, I replied, and hung up. Aunt Vittoria tried to approach from the other side. Honey, your mom isn't perfect, but she's still your mother. Think about it. What would your father want? Would he want her to get hurt? I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling anger rise. They used his name all the time when they wanted to put pressure on me. But none of them even really knew him. But I stood my ground. The father would like his daughter to stop being manipulated and used. And don't drag him into this, I said coldly. None of you even bothered to tell me the truth about the house all these years. I finally decided to seek professional help. The lawyer I hired, Mr. Machiavelli, turned out to be surprisingly straightforward. Here's the situation, he explained, laying out the documents on his desk. You are the legal owner of the house. You pay all taxes and bills. Your mother may try to claim the rights of a tenant because of the long-term residence, but considering that you maintained the property and she had free accommodation, any judge is likely to side with you. What is my next step? I asked. We'll give her an official eviction notice, he said. Actually, 2 weeks is even generous. You're in full compliance with your rights. I made him draw up all the necessary documents. When the 2 weeks were almost up, I went into the house with him. No one wanted to meet my mom one-on-one. The scene we found was exactly what I expected. Mom was crying. Zeta was screaming. The boxes were scattered everywhere. This is illegal. Mom screamed when she saw my lawyer. I'm going to sue you, Grazia. I'll take everything you have from you. Mr. Machiavelli remained completely calm. Mrs. Johnson, you can sue, of course, he said dryly. But I must warn you that you have little chance of winning. Moreover, the legal costs will be very significant for you. How can you do this to your own mother? Zeta shouted, rushing towards me. Where should we live? This is not my problem anymore, I replied, surprised at myself how little I feel. You have until tomorrow evening. All that remains will be considered abandoned property. Mom immediately changed tactics. Her voice suddenly became soft, pleading. Gracia, dear. She whispered, holding out her arms to me. Please forgive me for what I said at the party. I was upset. You know that's not what I meant. I've heard it all before. Manipulation. Fake apologies. I'm done with all this. Mr. Machiavelli will see to the final move tomorrow, I said, turning to the door. I don't want to see any of you anymore. Later, I learned from Aunt Sarah that Mom and Zeta had moved in with Felice, Zeta's fiancé. Apparently, grandiose wedding plans have now been postponed due to lack of funds. Mom told everyone who was willing to listen about her cruel, heartless daughter, who kicked her family out on the street. But here's the thing, for the first time in my life, I didn't care what she said about me. It's been 3 months since I evicted Mom and Zeta. The house was empty now. I couldn't bring myself to sell it or rent it out, but sometimes I drove by, remembering the days when it still seemed cozy. When everything was easier. Before Mom's manipulations became obvious. Before Zeta turned into a titled princess. Before I realized how much of my life I'd spent trying to please people who saw me as nothing more than a walking ATM. Last week, Aunt Sarah invited me for coffee. She was my rock in all of this. The only one who really supported my decision. When I arrived, she was already waiting for me at a table in a small cafe on the corner where we like to meet. How are you really doing? What is it? She asked when I sat down across from her. There was a plate of chocolate chip cookies on the table in front of her. She knew that I loved him more than I expected. I wrapped my arms around the warm coffee mug, feeling the hot steam rise to my face, filling me with a light sense of comfort. But there's something I haven't told anyone about yet, I said, staring at the surface of the coffee. Aunt Sarah waited patiently while I gathered my thoughts. I went to a therapist, I finally admitted. Dr. Capriano? She clarified. I nodded. She helped me understand a lot about my relationship with my mom and Zeta. About how my mother has been manipulating me ever since my father died, using grief and guilt to control me. Aunt Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Your father would be proud of you, you know that, right? She said softly. He was the most honest and straightforward person. I know he wouldn't want you to be used and manipulated. Even family, especially family. She got up and went to the bookshelf, pulling out an old, worn photo album. I've been meaning to give it to you for a long time. There are photos of your father before you were born, as well as your early years. We spent the next hour flipping through the pages. There were pictures I'd never seen before. Dad in college, Dad at his first job, Dad holding me in his arms when I was a baby. He had the same sincere smile in every photo. I stroked the time-darkened film with my fingers. Your mother, Aunt Sarah hesitated. I looked up. What? She changed after his death, my aunt said, lowering her eyes. I tried to be there to support you, but she pulled away. She married your stepfather so quickly. We were all worried, but she turned her back on us, said we were interfering. Before I could respond, my phone rang. I looked at the screen, a message from my cousin Rachel. For your information, their wedding has officially been cancelled. Felice tore everything up. Aunt Sarah noticed how my expression changed. What happened? I silently showed her the message. I should feel bad, right? I muttered. But to be honest, I'm glad. Felice is a good guy, my aunt remarked. He deserves better than to get involved in this mess. Have you heard anything else about them? What is it? She asked. I shook my head. Only what people tell me. I'm not sure if they're still living with Felice or not. According to rumors, Mom is now working full-time. For the first time in 20 years. And Zeta dropped out of college. Have you already stopped paying for her tuition? I sent an official letter through a lawyer. She explained that all financial support was being discontinued. In response, I received a hysterical voice message from my mom about how I was ruining Zeta's future. After that, I blocked her number. Aunt Sarah poured more coffee. You know, they tell everyone who's willing to listen that you're the villain in this story. I suddenly laughed. Let them tell you. I don't worry about what they think anymore. What's done is done. I'm not going to feel guilty for setting boundaries. We sat for a while longer, talking about something else, before I said goodbye and left. A week after visiting Aunt Sarah, I was working late at the office when the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I hesitated for a bit, but eventually I answered. Gracia, please don't hang up on me. I recognized the voice immediately. Felice. He sounded tired, almost exhausted. I need to talk to you. If it's about the wedding. Not really, he interrupted. I broke off the engagement. I leaned back in my chair. I'm sorry, Felice. He laughed hollowly. Don't. I have to thank you, actually. Watching how Zeta and your mother treated you, the way they behaved about the wedding. It opened my eyes. Zeta is not at all the person I thought she was. I stayed silent, letting him talk. After you evicted them, they moved in with me, he continued. I exhaled slowly. Well, of course. I thought it was temporary, he added hastily. Just until they find a place to live. But. He paused, and I realized that continuing didn't bode well. At first, I felt sorry for them. Felice was a decent guy, and I understood that he probably felt obligated to help. But then he started noticing things. They never offered to contribute to paying the bills, he said, and there was weariness in his voice. Zeta didn't want to look for a job. She said she was too stressed because of the wedding. And your mother. She kept saying you'd come to terms with it eventually. That you'd feel guilty and give them the money. I closed my eyes, feeling a migraine coming. Classic mom. The last straw was that I discovered them while looking through my personal documents, he continued. I opened my eyes abruptly. What? They were looking for information about my savings, my investments. They wanted to know how much I could spend on the wedding. His voice hardened. I talked to Zeta about it. Do you want to know what she said? I already knew the answer, but I asked. What? I think she said I'm selfish, just like you. If I really loved her, I would want to arrange her dream wedding. I took a deep breath. That's when I realized it was time to put an end to all this, Felice said. After talking to him, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. My phone rang again. A message from my cousin. Zeta was kicked out of Felice's house. Now she and her mother live with her grandmother. Zeta tells everyone that Felice cheated on her. Mom says you turned him against her. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my laptop and started browsing through the property listings. Maybe it's time to sell the house. In the end, use this money to buy a place closer to work. Somewhere where those painful memories wouldn't be. The next day, I met with my therapist, Dr. Capriano. "What do you think about all this?" "What is it?" she asked. I looked out the window, watching life go on down the street. "Do you know what is strange?" I turned to her. "I feel guilty for not feeling guilty." She smiled. "It feels great, doesn't it?" I nodded. "You've been programmed all your life to feel responsible for the happiness of your mother and sister. Naturally, it's strange for you now that you're finally getting rid of this programming." I sighed. I keep waiting for regret to sound in my head. I expect to hear a voice saying that I am a terrible daughter, a terrible sister. But this is not happening. Dr. Capriano looked at me carefully. "And what do you feel?" I shrugged my shoulders. Relief. I allowed myself to smile. And peace. It's like I can finally breathe. Dr. Capriano nodded. "That's because you didn't do anything wrong. Setting boundaries is not cruel. It is not selfish to refuse manipulation. You are not responsible for the consequences of their actions." I felt something warm spreading inside. I didn't have to feel guilty. When I left her office, my phone rang again. Another unknown number. I hesitated, but answered. "Grace." The voice of Zeta. She was crying. "Please. I've ruined everything. Felice dumped me. I have nowhere to go." I stood on the sidewalk, listening to her sobs. 6 months ago, I would have given up immediately. I would offer money, help, support. I would let myself feel guilty. I would return to the old patterns of behavior. But not now. "I'm sorry you're having a hard time, Zeta," I said in a flat voice. "I hope you figure it out. Gracia, please." "Good, bye." I hung up the phone. Blocked the number. And she went to her car. The sun was setting, turning the sky a warm shade of orange and pink. For the first time in many years, I felt truly free. They say blood is thicker than water. But I've learned that it's not always a good thing. Sometimes blood ties can drown you if you let them. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do, for yourself and for others, is to let go. I started the car and drove home. Not to the house where I grew up. Not in the past. And to my apartment. To my future. To a life where I finally put myself first. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.